Hello, my name is Harry Kazianis, and I'm the managing editor of The National Interest. Joining me today is Nick Gvosdev. Nick is actually the former editor of The National Interest. He's presently a contributing editor to The National Interest, as well as an esteemed professor at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, where actually I was born in Newport, Rhode Island. So Nick, we have many things going on right now in Russia and in Ukraine at present. There are reports today, just as a time reference, it's Friday afternoon, Eastern Standard Time in Washington. Reports are coming out of possible escalatory situations between Russia and Ukraine. So I think the big question on everybody's mind, would Russia invade Ukraine?
Well, first let me just say these are my own opinions, don't reflect any position taken by the War College. And the question of invasion is an interesting one, because certainly over the last several months we could have seen what we might describe as a special war in Ukraine. That is, where governments support insurgents or separatists using shadowy means of bringing in equipment and providing intelligence and logistics support, but usually with plausible deniability. What we're now looking at, and what this potential incursion across the Russia-Ukrainian border with the armored personnel carriers would represent, is direct invasion, what we might think of when we use the term, which is actual legal military forces of the Russian Federation crossing into Ukrainian territory. I think that the possibility for border clashes remains a high one, because we have this aid convoy, we've had accusations of shelling and of strikes back and forth across the border. Would the Russians continue to move directly to occupy territory of Ukraine? Would they march on Kiev, for example? There, I think it's a lot less likely unless several conditions are met. The first condition would be that the separatist movement would essentially need to be on the final ropes. I think that as long as you have viable separatist movements that the Russians can support quietly with plausible deniability in Donetsk and Luhansk, they will not seek to introduce regular Russian forces into Ukraine. If that changes, you might see a push for a Russian intervention on humanitarian grounds. And of course, the Russians are very good now at recycling US discussions of what constitutes a humanitarian intervention. They would make a claim about a civilian population that's at risk, that there is an immediate need to protect, and then they would bring forces in. I don't think we're at that level yet. The other wild card that we'll have to see what happens is what occurs with gas transportation. This week, the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, had the first reading of a bill passed that would allow the Ukrainian government to block the shipment of Russian natural gas across the territory of Ukraine to European customers. If Ukraine moves ahead with such a plan where energy supplies to Europe would be disrupted, that might also be a change in Russian calculus, which would then say that there would be a lot less to lose if the Russians move into Ukraine. Because one of the things that's held them back has been the fact that throughout all of this crisis, throughout the loss of Crimea, throughout all of the accusations, the gas has been flowing unimpeded. If that stops, then I think we're in a new condition.
Okay. Well, speaking of gas, I'd like to sort of maybe move to something interrelated, which is the question of sanctions. So there's been multiple rounds of sanctions by the United States, by Brussels. There's been some talk, and it's been in the pages of The National Interest, that there could be a possibility on the Russian side that they could withstand some of these sanctions. As you know, Russia has a very low debt to GDP ratio, somewhere around 33%. They have very high foreign exchange reserves, I think second or third in the world. So does Russia have the capability to sort of withstand this? And if so, how long?
Yeah. That's a very, very topical question, and it really goes to this question of who would blink first. Because ultimately what all of these sanctions and counter-sanctions rely upon is an assumption that who will not be able to take the heat and will begin to blink and back away. The Russians up to this point have indicated that sanctions are a problem, so that despite some of this talk from the Russian side that sanctions haven't had any impact, that's not true. It's very clear that sanctions have had an impact. But they haven't been crippling in the sense that there are still alternatives that the Russians have available to them. So that, for instance, if Western companies don't want to sell technology to the Russians, we know that the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans have made advances that they could perhaps fill in some of those gaps. If there are sanctions on the Russian energy industry in the West, that there are customers elsewhere in the world, so that the Russians could find less optimal solutions but still find some solutions. The ultimate sanctions that would be directed against Russia that would really have the impact would be the complete cessation of any purchase of energy by the West, which is, I think, a sanction that the West is not going to impose simply because the West doesn't have alternatives at this point to Russian energy. You don't have adequate supplies, say, of natural gas from other sources that could replace the natural gas that Europe consumes from Russia. So in that sense, the Russians believe that they can weather sanctions. It also depends on whether or not the preparation that has been made in advance. There's apocryphal stories that supposedly last year, as the Ukrainian crisis first began to heat up, supposedly President Vladimir Putin met with various Russian business figures and essentially predicted that there would be rocky roads ahead, that it was time to start preparing, that they had to take into account that their relations with the West might come under threat, and to take measures necessary for that. And there's also a sense that, again, the unexpected potential benefit for sanctions from the Russian side is to spur some domestic development, so that if, as we've seen, if certain, with the Russian counter-sanctions, if certain Western food substances aren't being imported into Russia, cheese, wine, things like that, the sense of could this be used to gin up Russia's own domestic production, and then for newer suppliers that would like to break into the Russian market. I mean, certainly the Brazilians, the Argentinians, and others who have traditionally not had a big role in the Russian market are certainly looking forward to any openings that they might have. But it's clear that there will be, the sanctions do create problems for the Russian economy, but for the short term, the typical nationalist reaction means that Putin probably has 6 months to a year, definitely, of where he can weather higher costs and he can weather these difficulties without it creating too much of a political pressure. After about a year, I think we then move into new and uncharted territory.